English, Canada, America, Brexit. We'll be talking about all these things right now. Hello audience, Mr. Z here with what I guess you could call an upgrade, even if it's only temporary. Unless this finally gets me unbanned from the EU, but regardless. The English-speaking world, a product of imperial expansion at its finest. From North America to South Africa. From Australia to India. From this small kingdom on this little island, spread what would become the third most spoken language on the planet. But today, the British Empire lies quietly off the coast of mainland Europe. Its empire diminished. Its global role reduced. Its population blocked from watching my videos. Still think Brexit isn't a good idea? Brexit is part of what motivated me to make this video, and getting banned from the EU, but mostly Brexit. In my research to get unbanned, I came across more and more information that I pieced together into a fascinating what-if scenario. But before that, here's some background information. Britain had reluctantly joined the European Union in 1973, nearly 3 decades after its initial inception as the European Coal and Steel Community. Britain had joined and remained in the 70s at a vote of about 60 to 40. Economically, things looked optimistic for the EU at the time, but not so much for the UK. Who was hemorrhaging wealth since the loss of India, the implementation of decolonization, and the loss of dominance to the US? No longer could Britain rely on its Commonwealth, colonies, or even its reputation. It had been crippled and was desperate to stay afloat, doing so at the loss of its own sovereignty. Upon joining the EU, Britain had to abide by the rules of the EU Council, accept the final judgments of EU courts, deal with blanket regulations imposed across all EU countries, accept quotas on countless things from immigration to fishing of all things, and much, much more. It quite literally got to a point of taxation without representation. I hope the irony of that isn't lost on you. The most common argument for the EU to remain has been a purely economic one. That without the hand-holding of the EU, Britain would be at an absolute loss. And this could be true, if, and only if, the EU were to cut ties with Britain and purposefully sanction or refuse to trade with it. Alone, Britain would no longer be suffering the same economic turmoil it had in the post-World War II era. But trade is of course important for the economy, especially in the case of an island nation like Britain, where resources are scarce. In the worst case scenario, Britain would lose its 2 top trade partners and several others down the line. However, looking to the statistics, the EU and Germany would only heavily impact imports, which run the UK deficit of over 86 billion. The US, Britain's 3rd largest trade partner, earned a profit of 9 billion. So clearly there will be an adjustment, but it doesn't seem like the UK will be massively constrained. Of course, without the EU as a trade partner, exactly who would Britain turn to in such a situation? Well, some time ago there were talks between Prime Minister Theresa May and President Donald Trump. Now, supposedly there was an arrangement to establish an exclusive US-UK trade alliance once Brexit went through. However, because of the soft Brexit strategy opted for by May, which would essentially amount to remaining in the EU, President Trump refused to accept this, stating, "We'd be making deals with the European Union and not the UK." She, referring to Theresa May, wrecked it. Thus, the plan was scrapped, and Britain remains locked in its abusive relationship with the EU. And, just recently, as of today, while I'm recording this, the EU has actually rejected Theresa May's proposal for a soft Brexit. The thought of what an exclusive US-UK trade deal could have set in motion really captivated me, because I couldn't help but see it evolving to much, much more. There's a shared language, a shared history, shared business interests, and complementary economies. What we know about the trade deal as it stood then was that it would create an environment in which US and British agencies like the FDA or FSA could share standards and policies for more streamlined economic regulation. It would also mean the end of tariffs and barriers between the 2 states and complete mutual recognition economically. This went further with some on the British end suggesting we draw in other similar nations into what would become, quote, a tremendous new trade axis. The nations mentioned by name being Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, former members of the British Commonwealth, all English speakers, each with similar quality standards, unique and valuable resources, and again, highly complementary economies. An Anglo-Union, or United Anglosphere as it were. A union capable of competing with the German-dominated European Union, a union which still may be salvageable and formable in our very own timeline if the right moves are made. Now, of course, before we go any further, we're going to be getting into something of an alternate future, but I'm fine speculating. It's basically my job. So, what would a united Anglosphere mean for the world? What would it look like? How would it function? Well, let's get into the nitty-gritty. The first step would be the separation of the UK from the EU. The Republic of Ireland, of course, poses something of a problem, as it shares a border with British Northern Ireland, and has expressed a desire to remain, although temperaments have been starting to sway in the wake of EU censorship of the internet. The UK would almost certainly be ostracized by the European Union, and a soft Brexit, me having written this down prior to today, may not be enough to satisfy the EU, and I was correct, seeing this as a stretching of and disrespecting of their authority and law. Thus, in this timeline, the UK, preferably through its own means, but most realistically through their gradual rejection by the EU, would find itself freed. Ireland would remain, for now, and a border would need to be enforced. Immediately, the British economy would take a blow that would take a while to restabilize from. However, there are plans set in place to prevent significant economic crisis in this event, which should take off most of the load until things have adjusted. Assuming Britain willingly proceeded with Brexit, which they didn't in our timeline, the US would be willing to revive the trade partnership, having redrafted it to include close ally Australia and its northern neighbor of Canada and New Zealand to establish the Anglosphere. A trade partnership whose united GDP would dwarf that of the EU's by nearly 10 trillion. The Anglosphere's values of free trade, free enterprise, and free speech would certainly attract the interests of Ireland and draw it closer into the group. An invitation would also be sent out to South Africa, another former Commonwealth state and English-speaking country, however only under the condition that it sees significant governmental, economical, and social reform. President Trump has expressed concern over South Africa's abuse and oppression of its Boer population before. This, along with the nation's frail economy and damaged infrastructure, would leave it very much on the fence. But the potential to restore their nation to thriving conditions and bring it into lines with the US could be enough to motivate a necessary change. And if not, well, there's always the military option if things go bad with the Boers. While South Africa does have a rather measly GDP, they do bear the potential to grow that into one of the most prosperous economies on the continent, with the right leadership, of course. The leadership over the past decades there having been very deplorable, and very sad, really. But with proper direction, the vast resources of the South African state can be put to tremendous use. The farms can prosper once again, and for the first time in decades, it would see national growth instead of decline. The potential South Africa under the direction of the Anglosphere could have might be enough to push for that change. And there's also the notable advantage of it providing a number of shipping ports to easily ship from the American East Coast to Australia and New Zealand, which could significantly decrease shipping times and make trade all the more streamlined. Ideally, the Anglosphere would have a direct council made up of member nation leaders, or at least elected representatives to best serve the will of the majority. Also ideally, the raising of tariffs against Mexico and China implemented by President Trump would also extend to other members of the Union in a show of solidarity and a building of closer reliance on one another. This is easy enough for the US and Britain, however Canada and South Africa both house a number of Chinese assets and businesses. While this does offer a benefit to their economies, any reliance or loyalty to states outside of the Anglosphere would surely be on the chopping block. We could very likely expect foreign, non-Anglosphere businesses to be discouraged from setting up further shop within it, while those already here would need to abide by tighter rules and regulations than the Anglosphere members. Australia and New Zealand, because of their proximity to Asia, also believe to find themselves involuntarily tied into the Chinese economy. And again, while China would certainly have some influence over their economies, freeing themselves from it would not lead to total economic upheaval. Perhaps a minor recession at the very worst, and that only be until the transition into the Anglosphere was completed. Yes, there will be an adjustment period, and that's what scares most people who consider switching trade alliances or cutting off previous arrangements. But with both the US and Britain involved, the net benefit far outweighs the potential, and again, not assured, but potential losses. Bringing this union into reality would not be too difficult, as most of the pieces are already in play. The hardest part would be convincing new member states that this will be successful and is worth foregoing trade partnerships. Even then, these nations are already majority trade partners to each other, making it all the more reasonable. As American and Russian ties become less cold, so does the need for NATO begin to wane, and as President Trump has stated, the US has been paying more than its fair share for NATO, while other members slack behind. NATO members who are now outside the US's field of interest. As it appears the former Soviet Union won't be invading Europe anytime soon, so would we see NATO slowly dissolve, just as the Warsaw Pact did. and, in its place, a new military treaty established between Canada, Britain, Ireland, the US, Australia, New Zealand, Guyana, and South Africa. The Anglosphere members would gradually understand that no longer should they spread themselves thin attempting to appease everyone, and instead focus efforts on resolving issues within their homes and protecting the shared interests of their union. Now that the Anglosphere has gone the route of self-sufficiency and self-determinism, we should note that this doesn't mean the Union doesn't have influence elsewhere in the world. As a matter of fact, we'd likely see, thanks to the US, Britain, and Australia, a sphere of influence and allies all the way from Norway to Greenland, from the Caribbean to Indonesia, Japan, and more. These regions wouldn't be member states, but they are regions that would support and maintain regular trade with the Union despite tariffs. The US of Z thanks you for watching, support your legion by liking the video, or join our ranks by subscribing for more. This has been Mr. Z from the Alternate History Channel.